The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the dusty streets of Redemption Falls, a town that had forgotten what its name once promised. In the fading light of 1882, 18-year-old Thomas McKenna stood on the auction block behind Murphy's Saloon, his hands bound with rough hemp rope, his future being bartered away like livestock. "Do I hear $50 for this fine specimen?" hollered Silas Murphy, the saloon owner whose gambling debts had led to this moment. Strong back, good teeth, and untouched by the vices that plague most men his age. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the mountains met the darkening sky. He'd learned long ago that looking at the faces in the crowd only made the shame burn deeper. His father's debts had become his burden when consumption took the old man 3 months prior, leaving Thomas with nothing but his name and the clothes on his back, both of which were about to belong to someone else. The bidding was lackluster. Most folks in Redemption Falls barely had enough to feed their families, let alone purchase another mouth to feed. Thomas began to wonder if he'd end up in the silver mines, working in darkness until his lungs gave out like his father's. Then a voice cut through the evening air, like a church bell on Sunday morning. $100. Every head turned toward the source of that melodic declaration. Thomas couldn't help but look as well. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. She stood at the back of the small crowd, tall and graceful despite the simple black dress that marked her as a widow. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, but rebellious strands caught the lamplight like copper wire. Her face was neither young nor old, perhaps 30 years, but it held a strength that seemed to radiate from her green eyes. "Mom, you sure about that?" Murphy asked, clearly surprised. "That's more than this boy's worth by half." "Quite certain, Mr. Murphy." Her voice carried the refined accent of someone who'd known better times. "I have need of help on my ranch, and this young man appears capable." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, though he couldn't name what it was. Hope, perhaps. Or simply relief that his buyer wouldn't be one of the rough miners or cruel ranchers who'd been eyeing him like a piece of meat. The transaction was completed quickly. As the crowd dispersed, muttering about the widow's strange generosity, Thomas found himself standing before his new owner. Up close, she was even more striking, with kind eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Thomas McKenna, ma'am." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth. "I'm Catherine Hartwell." "Welcome to the Lazy H Ranch, Thomas." She reached for his bound hands, and he was surprised when she began untying the ropes instead of simply leading him away like livestock. "I believe in earning loyalty, not buying it." As the ropes fell away, Thomas rubbed his chafed wrists and studied this mysterious woman who'd just changed his fate. "Why did you buy me, Mrs. Hartwell, and for so much money?" Catherine's expression grew distant for a moment, as if she were looking at something only she could see. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Thomas, even when they don't know they need one yet." The ride to the Lazy H took them through some of the most beautiful country Thomas had ever seen. Rolling hills dotted with oak trees stretched toward distant peaks, and a creek meandered alongside the dirt road, its waters catching the last rays of sunlight. Catherine rode side saddle on a gentle mare named Duchess, while Thomas walked alongside, still too overwhelmed to make much conversation. The ranch house came into view as full darkness settled over the land. It was modest, but well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and warm light glowing in the windows. A barn and several outbuildings completed the homestead, all nestled in a valley that seemed protected from the harsh winds that scoured the open plains. "It's beautiful," Thomas said, the first words he'd spoken since leaving town. "My husband built most of it with his own hands," Catherine replied, dismounting with practiced ease. "He always said a home should feel like a shelter from the world's storms." They settled into a routine over the following weeks. Thomas proved himself a willing worker, tending to the small herd of cattle, mending fences, and helping with the endless tasks that kept a ranch running. Catherine was a fair employer, providing good meals and comfortable quarters in the bunkhouse. But Thomas sensed there was more to her story than she let on. He learned that her husband, Jonathan Hartwell, had died 2 years prior when his horse threw him during a thunderstorm. She'd been running the ranch alone since then, with occasional help from neighboring ranchers, but pride had kept her from accepting charity for long. "Why didn't you remarry?" Thomas asked one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The question slipped out before he could stop himself, and he immediately felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, ma'am. That wasn't my place to ask." Catherine smiled, a sad but genuine expression. "It's all right, Thomas, I suppose. It's natural to wonder." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently turning the simple gold band she still wore. "I loved my husband deeply. When you've had that kind of love, anything less feels like a betrayal of what you once had." Thomas nodded, though he couldn't truly understand. He'd never been in love, had barely even spoken to a girl his own age before his father's death had upended his world. But he could hear the pain in Catherine's voice, the way it caught slightly on certain words. "What about you?" she asked. "Is there a sweetheart you had to leave behind?" "No, ma'am. Never had time for such things, what with taking care of my father and trying to keep us fed." Thomas felt that familiar shame creep up his neck. At 18, most men his age had at least kissed a girl. But his life had been consumed by worry and work. Catherine must have sensed his embarrassment because she reached over and patted his hand gently. "There's no shame in being devoted to family, Thomas. Your father was lucky to have such a caring son." That simple touch sent an unexpected jolt through Thomas's entire body. He pulled his hand away quickly, mumbling something about checking on the horses. But the sensation lingered long after he disappeared into the barn, as autumn deepened into winter. Thomas found himself caught in a web of confusing emotions. His respect and gratitude toward Catherine had grown into something deeper, something that made his heart race whenever she smiled at him or brushed past him in the kitchen. He knew it was foolish. She was a refined woman who'd known real love, while he was just a boy who'd been sold like a piece of property. But the feelings wouldn't be ignored, especially during the long winter evenings when they'd sit by the fire, Catherine reading aloud from books of poetry, while Thomas pretended to focus on mending tack or sharpening tools. Her voice would wrap around him like a warm blanket, and he'd find himself memorizing every inflection, every pause. Catherine, for her part, had begun to notice changes in her young ranch hand. Thomas had filled out over the months, hard work, adding muscle to his lean frame. His face had lost some of its boyish softness, and she'd caught herself watching him more often than was proper. There was a gentleness in him that reminded her of Jonathan, but also a quiet strength that was entirely his own. The first real test of their growing bond came in February, when a late-season blizzard trapped them in the house for 3 days. On the second night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Catherine found Thomas staring out the frosted window with tears in his eyes. "What's troubling you?" she asked, settling beside him on the small settee. "I was just thinking about my father," Thomas admitted. "He died on a night like this, cold and alone, while I was in town trying to find work." His voice broke slightly. "I should have been there with him." Catherine's heart ached for the pain in his voice. Without thinking, she reached out and pulled him into an embrace, cradling his head against her shoulder as sobs shook his young body. She murmured soft words of comfort, stroking his hair as she might have comforted a child. But Thomas wasn't a child anymore, and as his tears subsided, they both became aware of their closeness in a way that made the air between them electric. Catherine's hand stilled in his hair, and Thomas slowly lifted his head to meet her gaze. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply looked at each other. Thomas saw understanding and compassion in Catherine's green eyes, but also something else, a longing that matched his own. Catherine saw the man Thomas was becoming, and recognized the dangerous territory they were approaching. "I should," she began, but Thomas's lips found hers before she could finish the thought. The kiss was gentle, tentative, nothing like the passionate embraces Catherine had shared with her husband. But it was filled with such pure emotion that it took her breath away. When they finally parted, both were trembling. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, his face flushed with shame and desire. "I shouldn't have." "No," Catherine said firmly, though her own voice was unsteady. "You shouldn't have, and neither should I." She stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "We must not let this happen again, Thomas. it wouldn't be right. But as she fled to her bedroom, Catherine couldn't ignore the way her heart was racing, or the warmth that Thomas's kiss had awakened in places she'd thought had died with Jonathan. The next few weeks were agony for both of them. They maintained their daily routines, speaking only when necessary about ranch business. But the air between them crackled with unspoken desire. Thomas threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, as if physical exhaustion might quiet the longings that kept him awake at night. Catherine busied herself with correspondence and accounting, anything to keep her mind occupied. But spring was coming, and with it, a reckoning neither of them could avoid. The trouble started when Jake Morrison, a neighboring rancher known for his cruel treatment of his workers and his wandering hands around women, began making regular visits to the Lazy H. He'd always been interested in Catherine's land, which bordered his own along a valuable water source. But his recent attention seemed focused on Catherine herself. "A woman like you shouldn't be living alone out here," Morrison would say, his cold eyes lingering on her in ways that made Thomas's blood boil. "Dangerous country for a widow. You need a man's protection." Catherine always declined his offers, politely but firmly, but Morrison's visits became more frequent and his manner more aggressive. One afternoon in early March, Thomas returned from checking fence lines to find Morrison's horse tied outside the house and Catherine's voice raised in anger from within. "I've told you repeatedly, Mr. Morrison, I have no interest in selling my land or accepting your courtship. Please respect my wishes and leave." "Now, Catherine, be reasonable," Morrison's gravelly voice replied. "You can't run this place alone forever. That boy you bought ain't much use when real trouble comes calling." Thomas stepped onto the porch, his jaw clenched with barely controlled fury. Through the window, he could see Morrison standing too close to Catherine, his bulk blocking her path to the door. "A smart woman would see the benefits of having a real man around," Morrison continued, reaching out to touch Catherine's face. "Someone who could protect you from all sorts of ... unpleasantness." Was enough. Thomas burst through the door, his young face dark with rage. "Get your hands off her." Morrison turned, his lips curling into a sneer. Well, well, the bot boy has some bark after all. "Run along, son. The adults are talking." "Thomas, please," Catherine said, but there was relief in her voice at his arrival. "Said get your hands off her," Thomas repeated, stepping forward despite Morrison being twice his size and armed with a gun at his hip. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You threatening me, boy? You forget your place real quick." His hand moved to rest on his pistol grip. "Maybe it's time someone reminded you what happens to livestock that forgets it ain't people." The insult hit Thomas like a physical blow, bringing back all the shame and helplessness of that day on the auction block. But this time, he wasn't alone and powerless. But this time, he had something worth fighting for. "I may have been sold," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite the danger. "But I ain't livestock. And I won't stand by and watch you threaten Mrs. Hartwell." The tension in the room was thick as molasses. Morrison's hand tightened on his gun, and Thomas had no weapon except his own courage. Catherine stood frozen between them, her heart hammering as she realized that her feelings for Thomas might cost him his life. "Jake Morrison, you take your hand off that gun this instant." The new voice belonged to Sheriff Ben Coleman, who'd appeared in the doorway with his own weapon drawn. The lawman was pushing 60, but his eyes were sharp and his hands steady. Sheriff Morrison said, forced joviality replacing his menace. "Just having a friendly conversation with my neighbors." "Didn't sound too friendly from outside, Coleman," replied Mrs. Hartwell. "Is this man bothering you?" "Yes, Sheriff," Catherine said, finding her voice. "I've asked him repeatedly to leave my property, but he refuses to respect my wishes." Coleman nodded grimly. "Jake, I think it's time you headed home, and I'd suggest you stay there unless Mrs. Hartwell specifically invites you back." Morrison's face flushed red with anger, but even he wasn't foolish enough to draw on the sheriff. "This ain't over," he snarled, looking directly at Thomas. "Boy like you needs to learn his place." After Morrison had ridden away, Coleman turned to Thomas with something approaching respect. "It was either very brave or very stupid, son. Morrison's killed men for less than what you just did. He was threatening Mrs. Hartwell, Thomas replied. Simply, I couldn't just stand there. Coleman studied the young man for a moment, then looked at Catherine, who was watching Thomas with undisguised pride and something deeper. The sheriff had been around long enough to recognize the signs of two people fighting feelings they shouldn't have. Well, Coleman said carefully, I'd advise you both to be extra careful for a while. Morrison doesn't forget slights, and he's got friends who are almost as unpleasant as he is. After the sheriff left, Catherine and Thomas found themselves alone again, the charged atmosphere from Morrison's visit still crackling between them. You could have been killed, Catherine said, her voice shaking with delayed reaction. Have shot you where you stood? Maybe, Thomas agreed. But I couldn't let him hurt you. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, loaded with all the feelings they'd been trying to suppress. Catherine looked at this young man who'd been willing to die for her, who'd faced down an armed bully without hesitation, and felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. Thomas, she whispered, and this time, when he reached for her, she didn't pull away. Their second kiss was different from the first, deeper, more desperate, filled with the recognition that life was uncertain, and love, when it came, should not be wasted. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. This is madness, Catherine said, but her hands were still gripping the front of his shirt. You're so young, and you're the most beautiful, kindest woman I've ever known, Thomas. Interrupted. I don't care about ages or what people might think. I love you, Catherine. I've loved you since the day you untied my ropes and gave me back my dignity. Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks. I love you too, she admitted. God help me, I do. But Thomas, this can never be more than it is right now. The world wouldn't understand. They'd destroy us both. But even as she spoke the words, Catherine knew they were already past the point of no return. Love had taken root in both their hearts, and like all living things, would either grow or die, but it couldn't be ignored. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing with it both new life and new dangers. Morrison kept his distance, but his hired hands began appearing at odd times around the Lazy H's borders, always with plausible excuses but clearly watching and waiting for something. Thomas and Catherine tried to maintain their usual routines, but their stolen moments became more frequent and more precious. They would find excuses to work together, their hands brushing as they reached for the same tool, their eyes meeting across the dinner table with silent communication that spoke volumes. One evening in late April, as they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. Thomas, she said quietly, there's something I need to tell you about my marriage to Jonathan. Thomas turned to her, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to reveal. I loved him dearly, she continued, but our marriage was ... arranged. My father had debts much like yours did. Jonathan needed a wife to help him establish his ranch and his standing in the community. It was a business arrangement that grew into genuine affection over time. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. I never knew what it felt like to choose love for myself, Thomas. Not until you. The confession hung between them like a bridge, and Thomas understood that Catherine was offering him something precious. Not just her love, but her choice to love. What are you saying? He asked, hardly daring to hope. I'm saying that maybe it's time I stopped living for what other people think is proper and started living for what makes me happy. Catherine reached for his hand. If you'll have me, Thomas McKenna, I'd like to be your wife. Thomas felt as if the earth had shifted beneath him. Catherine, are you sure? People will talk. They'll say terrible things about both of us. Let them talk, she said with more conviction than she'd felt in years. I'm tired of being afraid of living. They were married quietly the following week by a traveling preacher, who asked no questions about their ages or circumstances. Sheriff Coleman served as witness, along with Doc Morrison, no relation to Jake, the town's physician who'd been Catherine's friend since Jonathan's death. The simple ceremony took place in Catherine's now-there parlor. With wild flowers from the meadow serving as decoration, Catherine wore her best blue dress, and Thomas had traded work for a new shirt and tie from the general store. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas's kiss was gentle and reverent, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune, but their happiness was destined to be tested almost immediately. Jake Morrison had been biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike back at the boy who'd humiliated him and the woman who'd rejected him. The news of their marriage provided the perfect opportunity. 2 days after the wedding, Morrison rode into town with a story calculated to inflame the community's sense of moral outrage. He spread word that Catherine Hartwell had corrupted. A naive young man, taking advantage of his dependent position to satisfy her unnatural desires. "It ain't right," Morrison proclaimed in Murphy's saloon, knowing his words would spread like wildfire. "A decent woman don't marry a boy she bought like livestock. There's something unnatural about it, something that goes against God and nature." Gossip spread quickly through Redemption Falls, growing more twisted and vicious with each telling. Some people defended Catherine, remembering her kindness and the way she'd helped neighbors in times of trouble. But others, particularly those who'd always resented her dignity and independence, seized on the scandal with righteous indignation. The worst of it reached Thomas and Catherine through Sheriff Coleman, who rode out to warn them that a group of concerned citizens led by Morrison were planning to confront them. "They're talking about having the marriage annulled," Coleman explained grimly. "Morrison's got them convinced that Thomas was coerced or taken advantage of. There's even talk of having Catherine arrested for moral corruption of a minor." "I'm 18, Thomas protested. "I'm of legal age to make my own decisions." "Legal age, maybe. But you were her property when this all started," Coleman replied. "It's Morrison's," making it sound like she groomed. "You from the beginning." Catherine felt sick. She'd known this might happen, but the reality was worse than her fears. "What can we do, Sheriff?" "Could leave," Coleman suggested reluctantly. "Head west where nobody knows your story. Start fresh somewhere else." The idea of running away like criminals made Thomas's jaw clench with anger. "We've done nothing wrong. Why should we run?" "'Cause sometimes being right ain't enough to keep you safe," Coleman said quietly. "And because Morrison ain't likely to stop at gossip. He's talking about protecting the community's moral standards. But what he really wants is your land, Catherine, and revenge on the boy who made him look like a fool." That night, as they lay in their marriage bed, Catherine and Thomas held each other close and spoke in whispers about their impossible situation. "Maybe we should go," Catherine said. "I won't have you hurt because of my selfishness." "It wasn't selfish," Thomas replied firmly. "And I won't run from bullies and gossips. This is our home, Catherine. We have a right to be happy here." Happiness seemed increasingly fragile as the days passed. Neighbors who'd once been friendly turned cold. The general store owner served them grudgingly, if at all. Children threw stones at their wagon when they drove to town. The breaking point came on a warm May evening when Morrison and 6 of his men rode up to the ranch house. Thomas was in the barn, and Catherine was alone when they arrived. "Evening, Catherine," Morrison called out, his voice falsely jovial. "Thought it was time we had a proper conversation about your situation." Cute Catherine stepped onto the porch, her rifle in her hands. "You're not welcome here, Jake. Leave now." Morrison dismounted, his men following suit. "Now that's no way to greet neighbors who are concerned about your welfare. See, we've been thinking that maybe you need protection from that boy you married. Maybe he's got some kind of hold over you that's making you act against your nature." "The only person I need protection from is you," Catherine replied, raising the rifle slightly. "Careful with that gun, Catherine. Wouldn't want anyone to get hurt." Morrison stepped closer, his men spreading out to flank the porch. "We're here to help you see reason. That boy's got to go, one way or another." It was then that Thomas emerged from the barn, alerted by the sound of voices. He saw the armed men surrounding his wife and felt something cold settle in his chest. "Get away from her," he called out, striding across the yard despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Morrison turned with a cruel smile. "There's the little stallion now. Come to protect your meal ticket, boy." "I came to protect my wife," Thomas said evenly, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Wife?" Morrison laughed harshly.
"You mean the woman who bought you like a piece
"Of horseflesh? Son, you're too young and stupid to understand what she's done to you." "I understand plenty," Thomas replied. "I understand that you can't stand seeing someone else happy when you're miserable. I understand that you want our land and you're using lies and hatred to try to get it. Morrison's face darkened. Careful, boy. You're already in more trouble than you can handle. The confrontation might have escalated into violence. But Sheriff Coleman chose that moment to arrive with 2 deputies, their rifles at the ready. Jake, what's this about? Coleman demanded. Just trying to talk sense into these folks, Sheriff Morrison replied, his tone suddenly reasonable. The boys obviously been taken advantage of, and we're concerned about the moral climate in our community. Seems to me the only one causing trouble for the moral climate is you, Coleman observed. Mrs. McKenna has every right to marry whoever she chooses, and Thomas is old enough to make his own decisions. McKenna. Morrison's eyes widened with sudden understanding. She took his name? That's rich. It's a bought boy giving his name to the woman who owned him. The insult was too much. Thomas started forward, his fists clenched, but Catherine's voice stopped him. Thomas, no, he's not worth it. But Morrison wasn't finished. You know what I think, Sheriff? I think there's something unnatural about this whole arrangement. Maybe we should examine just what kind of relationship they really had before this sham marriage. The implication was clear and vicious. Catherine gasped as if she'd been slapped, and Thomas saw red. This time, nothing could stop him. He launched himself at Morrison, his fist connecting with the older man's jaw with a satisfying crack. Morrison staggered backward, more surprised than hurt, but his men immediately moved to intervene. That's enough, Coleman shouted, firing a warning shot into the air. Everyone step back now. Temporary standoff allowed tensions to cool slightly, but Morrison was far from finished. You all saw that, he said, wiping blood from his split lip. The boy attacked me without provocation. Sheriff, I want him arrested for assault. Coleman sighed. Jake, you've been provoking him all evening. I'd say you got what you asked for. The law's the law, Sheriff. He struck me, and there are witnesses. Thomas realized with sinking heart that Morrison was right. Legally, he'd committed assault, regardless of the provocation. And in his current position, as a despised outsider, he was unlikely to receive much sympathy from a jury. I'll come quietly, Thomas said, resignation in his voice. No, Catherine cried out. Ben, you can't arrest him for defending his families. Honor Coleman looked genuinely pained. I'm sorry, Catherine. Jake's right about the law. But Thomas, I give you my word that you'll be treated fairly. As Coleman placed Thomas in handcuffs, Morrison smiled with cold satisfaction. Don't worry, Catherine. Once the boy's in jail, we can discuss your situation more reasonably, I'm sure. We can find a way to annul this unfortunate marriage and get you back on the right path. There is no right path without Thomas, Catherine said firmly. And I'll never accept your help or your courtship, no matter what you do to my husband. Morrison's expression hardened. We'll see about that. The trial was set for the following week, giving Morrison plenty of time to spread his version of events and rally community sentiment against Thomas. He painted a picture of a dangerous young man who'd manipulated a vulnerable widow, then turned violent when decent citizens tried to intervene. Catherine spent every day trying to find someone willing to testify on Thomas's behalf, but fear of Morrison's influence and social pressure kept most people silent. Even those who sympathized with the young couple were reluctant to speak publicly. The night before the trial, Catherine visited Thomas in his jail cell, bringing him a home-cooked meal and what comfort she could offer. I'm going to testify tomorrow, she told him through the bars. I'll tell them the truth about our marriage, about how you've never been anything but gentle and kind. Thomas reached through the bars to take her hand. Catherine, that might make things worse. If you defend me too strongly, Morrison will just use it as proof that I've got some kind of hold over you. I don't care what he says. I won't let them destroy you with lies. They held hands in silence for a long moment, both acutely aware that this might be their last private conversation for a very long time. If Thomas was convicted, he could face years in prison. I want you to know, Thomas said quietly, that even if everything goes wrong tomorrow, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. Tears streamed down Catherine's face.
Yeah.
Saved me too, Thomas. You reminded me what it felt like to be truly alive." The trial began the next morning in the town's small courthouse, packed with curious spectators eager to see the conclusion of the scandal that had dominated local gossip for weeks. Judge Williamson, a stern man in his 60s, called the court to order and reviewed the charges. Morrison testified first, painting himself as a concerned neighbor who'd only been trying to help a confused widow see sense. He described Thomas's attack as unprovoked violence, the act of a young man with dangerous tendencies. "Your Honor," Morrison said solemnly, "I fear for Mrs. Hart McKenna's safety.
Ow.
This boy has shown he's capable of violence when he doesn't get his way." Thomas's court-appointed lawyer, a young man named Robert Hayes, who'd recently arrived in town, did his best to cross-examine Morrison. But the rancher stuck to his story and had witnesses to back up his version of events. When Catherine took the stand, she spoke with quiet dignity about her relationship with Thomas, describing how their marriage had been based on mutual respect and genuine love. "Thomas has never raised a hand to me or shown any sign of violence," she testified. "He's gentle, hard-working, and honorable. The only time I've seen him angry was when Mr. Morrison threatened me in my own home." Mrs. McKenna, Morrison's lawyer, interrupted. "Isn't it true that this young man was your property before you married him? That you literally owned him?" Catherine's cheeks flushed, but she answered steadily. "I purchased his indenture contract. Yes, but I immediately freed him from any obligation to work for me. Our relationship developed naturally from mutual respect and affection. But surely you understand how this situation might appear to others. A mature woman in a position of power over a naive young man. Understand that people will think what they choose to think," Catherine replied. "But I know the truth of my own heart, and I know the truth of my husband's character." When Thomas took the stand in his own defense, he spoke simply and honestly about his feelings for Catherine and the events leading up to the confrontation with Morrison. "I struck Mr. Morrison because he insulted my wife in the most vile way possible," Thomas testified. "I'm not proud of resorting to violence, but I won't apologize for defending her honor." "And do you feel that your wife took advantage of your vulnerable position?" Hayes asked. "No, sir. Mrs. McKenna, Catherine gave me back my dignity and my freedom. Everything that happened between us was my choice, as much as hers." The prosecutor pressed Thomas on his age and experience, trying to make him seem like a victim who didn't understand his own situation. But Thomas's quiet confidence and obvious maturity undermined those arguments. The key moment came when Sheriff Coleman testified about Morrison's pattern of harassment and threats against Catherine. "In my opinion," Coleman said, "Jake Morrison has been the aggressor in this situation from the beginning. The boy was defending his wife from a man who'd been threatening her for months. As closing arguments began, it seemed the case could go either way. Morrison had the law on his side. Thomas had undeniably struck him. But Catherine and Thomas had the truth on theirs, and their obvious love for each other was harder to dismiss than Morrison had expected. Hayes made an impassioned plea for understanding and mercy. "Your Honor, we have here two people who found love in unlikely circumstances, have committed no crime except defying social conventions. Thomas McKenna struck Jake Morrison not from malice or criminal intent, but from the natural impulse to protect the woman he loves from a man who was threatening her with vile insinuations." The prosecutor countered that the law was clear: assault was assault, regardless of motivation. "We cannot allow violence to be excused simply because the perpetrator claims noble intentions," he argued. Judge Williamson retired to consider his verdict, leaving Thomas and Catherine to wait in agonizing uncertainty. The courthouse buzzed with speculation, a crowd clearly divided between those who sympathized with the young couple and those who felt justice demanded Thomas's conviction. When the judge returned, "This case has forced me to consider not just the letter of the law, but its spirit," he began. "There is no question that the defendant struck the plaintiff. Under normal circumstances, this would result in a clear conviction for assault." Thomas felt Catherine's hand grip his arm tightly. "However," the judge continued, "the evidence suggests that Mr. Morrison deliberately provoked this. confrontation through sustained harassment and threats against Mrs. McKenna. While the court cannot condone violence, it recognizes that Mr. McKenna was acting in defense of his wife's honor against a campaign of intimidation. The courthouse held its collective breath. Therefore, I find the defendant guilty of assault. But I sentence him to time already served, plus 1 year of probation, during which he must avoid any further altercations with Mr. Morrison or his associates. Catherine gasped with relief, while Morrison's face darkened with fury. It wasn't the vindication Thomas had hoped for, but it was freedom. Furthermore, Judge Williamson added, I strongly advise Mr. Morrison to cease his harassment of the McKenna family. Any further complaints? Of threatening behavior will be dealt with severely. As they left the courthouse, Lisa and Catherine were met by a small group of supporters Sheriff Coleman, Doc Morrison, and a few neighbors who'd finally found the courage to show their support publicly. It's not over, Coleman warned quietly. Jake Morrison doesn't take defeat well, and he's got friends who are even less reasonable than he is. Indeed, over the following months, the McKennas faced continued harassment. Their cattle were occasionally scattered, their fences cut, and supplies they'd ordered in town sometimes mysteriously disappeared. But they persevered, drawing strength from their love and their determination to build a life together. As summer faded into autumn, Catherine discovered she was carrying Thomas's child. The news filled them both with joy and trepidation. A baby would make them even more vulnerable to their enemies. But it also represented the ultimate proof of their love's legitimacy. The harassment escalated when Morrison learned of Catherine's pregnancy. His men became bolder in their attacks on the ranch, and rumors spread through town that the baby couldn't possibly be Thomas's. The final confrontation came on a cold November evening when Morrison and a dozen armed men surrounded the ranch house. This time, there was no pretense of civil conversation. Morrison had come to end the situation once and for all. "Come out, boy," Morrison shouted from the yard. "Time to settle this like men." Thomas peered through the window, his heart sinking as he counted the armed men. Catherine stood beside him, one hand protectively over her growing belly, the other gripping her rifle. "There are too many of them," she whispered. "Thomas, take the back way out. Get to Sheriff Coleman." "I'm not leaving you," Thomas said firmly. "We face this together or not at all." Morrison's voice rang out again, slurred with whiskey and hatred. "You hear me, boy? You've poisoned this community long enough with your unnatural marriage. Time to pay the price." Thomas made his decision. He kissed Catherine gently, then stepped onto the porch with his hands visible, but his chin raised defiantly. "I'm here, Morrison. What do you want?" "What I've always wanted to clean up this town's moral decay. You're going to get on a horse and ride out of here tonight, never to return? And your wife is going to have that sham marriage annulled?" "That's not going to happen," Thomas replied steadily. "Catherine is my wife, and this is our home. If you want us gone, you'll have to kill us both." Morrison's laugh was ugly. "That can be arranged, boy. You think anyone in this town will mourn a couple of degenerates?" It was then that Sheriff Coleman's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Jake Morrison, you and your men are trespassing on private property with the clear intent to commit violence. I'm ordering you to disperse immediately." Morrison turned to see Coleman emerging from the darkness with 6 deputies, all armed and ready. The sheriff had been expecting this confrontation and had positioned his men strategically around the property. "This is a private matter, Sheriff," Morrison snarled. "Between neighbors. Nothing private about a dozen armed men threatening a pregnant woman," Coleman replied. "Boys, arrest anyone who doesn't start riding away in the next 30 seconds. For a tense moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. Morrison's men outnumbered the lawmen, but they were spread out and had been caught off guard. Several of them began to back toward their horses, unwilling to risk their lives for Morrison's vendetta. "This isn't over," Morrison spat, but he was already retreating. "Mark my words, Sheriff, this poison will spread. You'll rue the day you protected these degenerates." As Morrison and his remaining men rode away, Coleman approached the porch where Thomas and Catherine stood, holding each other. "Pack your things," the sheriff said quietly. "Both of you, tonight. Ben, this is our home. Catherine protested. Can't let him drive us away. Catherine, I can't protect you indefinitely. Morrison's got political connections, and he's convinced half the county that you two represent some kind of moral threat. Coleman's weathered face was grave. There's been talk of vigilante action, of burning you out. I won't see you, and that baby hurt because of one man's hatred. Thomas felt Catherine sag against him, finally accepting what they'd both known was inevitable. Where would we go? I've got a cousin in Colorado Territory, Coleman offered.
Nice.
Country, plenty of opportunity for a young couple willing to work hard, and nobody there would know your story. That night, as they packed their few precious belongings, Catherine and Thomas mourned the loss of the home they'd built together. But they also felt a strange sense of relief. They would finally be free to love each other without fear or shame. Sorry, Catherine whispered as they worked. Sorry that loving me has cost you everything. Thomas stopped packing and took her in his arms. Catherine, you haven't cost me anything. You've given me everything: love, dignity, purpose, and now a family. A place is just a place, but a home is wherever we're together. They left Redemption Falls before dawn, traveling light and fast toward a new life in Colorado Territory. Sheriff Coleman had provided them with a wagon,